Been playing First Berserker Khazan for a bit now and I've stumbled upon this enemy. It might be one of the worst designed enemies I've seen in my life, and I've seen some shit. Welcome to a short ramblings of a madman video inspired by First Berserker Khazan, you incontinent bastards. I talk a lot about the enemy designs in my reviews and how important it is, especially in action RPGs. More action RPGs I play over time, like Rise of the Ronin, Khazan, Avowed, Lords of the Fallen, the more I respect the work done by From Software in Dark Souls and Bloodborne, Elden Ring excluded. Reason is that in most cases they have very consistent enemies, bosses included, from what I remember. Though I would have to go back to confirm every detail what I remember, but no time at the moment. Consistent meaning that they don't have near enough rule-breaking bollocks like some of the other games and have stable designs that lead to sometimes predictable combat, and nowhere near as cool as something like Neo, Ronin and Khazan, but it's stable. Each new encounter you can actually play and don't need to learn moves first. In games like Khazan, forget about that. First you die 55 times and then after learning everything that you can about the enemy, success comes. That's not skill, that's pattern recognition through repetition. Khazan invalidates skill in lots of enemy designs in a bad way because of the inconsistency and truly some bad ideas, which is a shame, because when it comes to the combat system, looking at what player can do, it might be one of the most polished and well executed games of all time. Bosses could have been some of the best ever due to amount of moves, incredible aesthetics and overall cool factor, which would elevate Khazan to truly something special. But unfortunately they went with a lot of cheap things for a lot of bosses that I'm going to cover in more detail in the review. This elite enemy has all of the problematic aspects of Khazan's enemy designs across the whole game. Biggest Khazan's enemy design issue is the incredibly inconsistent poise system with a nonsensical hyper armor frequency that makes anticipation impossible. Basically, same attack that you do might stagger them one time, and then it might not stagger them at all, even though it's the exact same thing. Then when interrupting enemy attacks, sometimes hyper armor is going to invalidate your attack by just going through it, while other time the same exact scenario is going to play out differently where enemy is going to be staggered and interrupted upon getting hit by your attack. Why? I can't make any sense of it, and I've tried throughout the whole game. You know I like to analyze these things, but I'm stumped. Such poise system combined with nonsensical enemy damage output, meaning very little damage output difference between various attacks as almost everything is mid to high damage, creates tons of cheap deaths. This elite enemy is shielded, so of course it should have more poise than others, that's not the issue. Problem is when his counterattack starts, which is the same problem as with most other enemies, including bosses. It's impossible to know. Suddenly he stops getting staggered and retaliates while you're mid-combo. Not as problematic with this enemy, but with bosses it is how most damage to the player is done. Mid-combo fast hyper armor retaliation and with added tons of visual effects, it is difficult to recognize that the attack is coming. Then this elite enemy also has very high health pool. On top of that he heals himself whenever he hits you with the shield. Couple bosses also have healing mechanics next to very large health pools. That is very cheap design. It should be either or, not both. That would make fights different between large health pool enemies and smaller health pool enemies with healing potential. Large health pool and healing is just lack of creativity. Basically throw on top of the enemy every possible thing that would make it more powerful. Next thing that is the consistency problem in Khazan are tracking attacks. For the most part tracking is done right in boss fights. But then there are attacks that have 90 to 95% tracking, meaning it's incredibly difficult to avoid them by positioning yourself properly. High tracking invalidates positioning and leaves only block and dodge to deal with it. Positioning in From Software games except Elden Ring is very important, which showcases the stability of the enemy design by not having too much tracking on enemy attacks. This enemy in particular has 95 to 100% tracking on almost all of his attacks. And it's using a long weapon, which would be a perfect weapon to counter with proper movement, and by that I'm not talking pressing the dodge button. So on top of a long reach, powerful weapon, they've added insane amount of tracking with almost every attack. Again, just throwing shit on top of an already powerful enemy. Elite enemies in this game are some of the worst designed enemies I've seen in gaming, with no creativity. They have been added parameters instead of moves and AI. Like frenzy mechanic that makes them immune to stagger. Very creative. So they just swing at your sorry ass that can retaliate once every blue moon against their large health pools. So what makes elite enemies elite? Breaking the rules. This is a problem in many games that don't seem to have the capability to create enemies that can actually challenge you in many ways without the need to operate outside of boundaries. I like to call that breaking the mold of combat. Why do developers create such enemies? One of the reasons is lack of proper defensive AI. They need to break the rules to challenge the player in cheap ways because they don't have other capabilities. They can only do offense, but not defense. This is why I consider human bosses in Neo some of the best bosses in gaming, especially in dojo missions, not counting the cheap damage output and inconsistent tracking. They can actually do something defensively, which makes combat far more interesting because it isn't just a simple back and forth anymore. Anyway, quick ramblings, video done. Had to share this, thanks for watching.